Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I hope that you're all doing as well as can be expected these days, what with a worldwide pandemic and some intense, hopefully productive civil unrest. Thank you for taking time to join our listening session today with the Minnesota Department of Employment and Economic Development and the department's commissioner, Steve Grove. Like Sandra said, my name is Marie Ellis. I'm the Public Policy Director at the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits. We want to thank Propel for Nonprofits for co-hosting this event, and also thank DEED for their interest in hearing directly from nonprofits about how we are experiencing the world right now, particularly related to employment and economic development. One quick note before I turn it over to Commissioner Grove, MCN is hosting a call tomorrow from 1 to 2 p.m. with the Office of the Governor and Lieutenant Governor, and also Commissioner Rebecca Lucero, who's with the Minnesota Department of Human Rights, will be joining us. Topics for that call include policing and advancing racial equity in Minnesota. So if you're interested, which hopefully you are, please go to our website. It's minnesotanonprofits.org/events, or of course you can just Google it and find it that way. Again, that's tomorrow from 1 to 2. And now to Commissioner Grove. We look forward to hearing a bit about where your department is at, and also what kinds of topics would be the most useful for you to hear about on today's call. So with that, Commissioner, the virtual floor is yours.
Great, thanks, Marie. Can you hear me? All right, well, thanks everyone for joining this conversation. I've been looking forward to this, and I'm looking forward to mainly taking your questions and hearing what's on your minds. This is really a listening session for me to do the listening, so I'll be very brief up top, but I'll just say this, that we know that the events of the last 3 months and certainly the events of the last 2 weeks have affected not just businesses, but nonprofits across our state too. And, you know, here at DEED, we partner with hundreds of nonprofits across the state on the work that we do in workforce development. And so we're hearing very clearly from nonprofits that there's just a whole new host of challenges when it comes to service delivery in a pandemic. And certainly the needs are only greater as unemployment is hitting record highs, and so many businesses have faced challenges they've never imagined having to face in the history of their existence, and certainly that none of us could have ever predicted. We know that Minnesota is a state that has one of the richest nonprofit sectors in the country. 1 in 8 workers in the state are in the nonprofit sector. That's about 13% of employment in the state is employed by a nonprofit, which is impressive. And I can say, just from a personal standpoint, my wife and I run a nonprofit ourselves called Silicon North Stars that focuses on getting young Minnesotans in underserved communities in both Minneapolis and St. Paul opportunities to pursue careers in technology. And this has totally changed our nonprofit's state of affairs. Much harder to fundraise right now. And for us, you know, one of the keystone experiences of our nonprofit is a 1-week-long summer camp where we bring students together to do a bunch of experiential learning with technology companies and leaders. And we've had to cancel that for the first time in 7 years this year, given the pandemic. So I know that's just one example. It's a small example, but it's my own of just how challenging this time is for the nonprofit sector, and how we're having to rethink, you know, how we reach people and help people and make this state great. So, you know, I feel grateful to be a part of the nonprofit community in this state, and indeed to be in a position to help grow the nonprofit community in our state, and want to do the best that we can to respond to this moment in a way that brings this community together and ensures that government's working very well with nonprofits to help Minnesota do better. And, you know, regardless of how the coming weeks play out, the coming months and years are going to be a real climb out of what is clearly a pretty intense recession. I'm sure you all saw the data yesterday from the Federal Reserve on projected unemployment rates, projected inflation. GDP should be down by about 5% this year. It has never been a more important time to have a robust and thoughtful and talented nonprofit market in our state than it is right now, because we're going to need to work together, and we have a lot of work ahead as we really rebuild and, I would say, reimagine our economy in the wake of all that's taken place. So it's going to take partnership, it's going to take working together, and it's going to take us trying stuff that we've never tried before, and holding all of ourselves accountable for real results, not just rhetoric, at a time when we face some pretty steep challenges, and they brought into, I think, pretty stark relief given, I think, particularly the civil unrest and protests in the aftermath of the killing of George Floyd. So I'll leave it there. I just wanted to kind of let you know what's on our minds here. And I'm mainly eager to hear your questions and engage in a conversation about how Dee can do a better job in the community, what the issues that you're facing are, and anything you want to know about our response to this effort, even if it's not related to nonprofits. Happy to answer any question that you have. And I'm joined, of course, by the wonderful Maureen Ramirez, who is our Director of the Office of Economic Opportunity here at DEED, and also previously worked at Propel, and is deeply connected and engaged in the nonprofit community as well. So we'll both be here to engage with you all. And I guess, Marie, with that, I'll turn it back to you, and excited to begin the conversation.
Excellent. And I'll ask Sandra to remind folks again how they can raise their hands.
Yep, so these instructions will stay on your screen as a slide. So you will have that raised hand tool at the bottom of your screen, so go ahead and use it as you have a comment or insight to share. And then Marie will call on you, and we will invite you to unmute your line. So, and please, as you have comments to share, start with your name, your organization, and your city or town. And this really is meant to be a listening session, and so please do engage by your voice or via chat.
And this is my first time using the hand raise function, so this might be a little bumpy. I'll also note that I'm certain to mispronounce names. So when you introduce yourself, just pronounce it the way you do, and we'll try to learn. Thank you. Let's see. I do see one hand up. Okay, Jean Keenan.
Yes, thank you. I'm Jean Keenan with LifeWork Planning Center. We're housed in Mankato, and we serve a 9-county area in southern Minnesota, serving displaced homemakers and women in transition. And actually, I've had the opportunity to meet with you, Commissioner Grove, in the past, so thank you for your time and your willingness to be so actively engaged with those of us providing direct services, particularly around employment issues. So I have seen a lot of information about an impact on female-dominated services like personal services, leisure, and hospitality services. So we can see that women are being disproportionately impacted at this time by the pandemic. And so I'm just wondering, in terms of any kind of specific targeting of that group, in addition to minority-owned businesses that we know may not be returning as we try to move back into our new normal. And for that, I'll just listen for a response.
Great, thanks, Jean. It's a great point. We have seen unemployment numbers, and at least from the perspective of applications, tilt more female than male in this crisis. Hard to say exactly why, but I think part of it is the demographics of the industries that have been hardest hit when you look at personal care services, healthcare, and the hospitality industry. And so I think you're right that, and then certainly I think we all are very well aware that the numbers as it relates to targeted racial groups, Blacks, American Indians, Hispanics, Asians, and others also are demonstrably higher in unemployment than white folks. So this crisis has not hit all people equally. And so we have been very targeted in our response on a couple fronts. One is just making sure the information about our services is targeted to communities of color and those who might not usually, be on the DEED email list, for example. Maureen and Hamza and myself and others in our department are doing a lot of ethnic media outreach. We're doing paid media in different outlets to get that information out there. We're doing a very targeted and focused effort to make sure that, that communities understand what's available to them. Second, in our small business emergency loan program, we worked very intently with a series of lenders who focus on communities that are usually hardest hit, and targeted communities as well. And so we think about 35% of that $30 million that we put in that first round of small business grants from the state went to businesses owned by people of color. And then I think in this next round of the legislative session, which kicks off, of course, tomorrow, we are looking at a small business loan grant program, rather. At this point, we're in the grants realm, using some federal CARES Act dollars that'll help small businesses continue to try to weather this storm. And for that program, we have carve-outs for minority-owned businesses, for women-owned businesses, for ethnic malls, and for organizations that are hardest hit. I think when a crisis like this hits different groups more heavily, then your response should recognize that. And so we're trying to root all of our response in those values, and it's not something that we always can just decide. Obviously, we're negotiating with the legislature and all these things, but it's been really the top priority of us in those negotiations to make sure that we're targeting our response. That said, I bet you there's a lot more we could do that we're not doing. So I'd love to hear any ideas folks have on this call or elsewhere on ways DEED could get this right more than we are. Those are just a few of the things that we're focused on, but you deserve a strong approach from your state government, and I want to make sure we're getting advice from you on how we can get that right.
Thank you, and thank you, Jean, for the question. Up next, we've got Paul Slack, and then Allie Strong Martin, and then I'll check in with Kate, my colleague at Propel for Nonprofits, to see what questions have been coming in through the written chat. So, Paul, you're on.
Yeah, first of all, hi, Marie. Paul Slake, Lutheran Social Service of Minnesota. I live in the Brooklyn Park area, but I work out of the central office in St. Paul for Lutheran Social Service when I was showing up in person. So there's been a renewed interest since the pandemic on a lot of frontline workers, people in differing places, grocery store workers, et cetera. And so we've talked some about that and some about valuing them. What I have not seen, though, is that value monetized within the legislature by talking about increasing their wages, for a temporary wage increase because of how much they and their families are exposed either to coronavirus or how they have to show up in person for work and all of that. And so I want to know if there's any talk around how we're going to value them differently as long as we're in the pandemic and then thereafter. So not only grocery store workers, but also many, many frontline workers who are typically lower wage workers, and many of whom are not full-time, many of whom don't have adequate health care, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Thanks, Paul. It's a great point, and you're absolutely right. I mean, it is the grocery store worker, it is the personal care aide, it is the hospital worker, it's the food truck driver. There's a whole host of individuals who are now really frontline workers who had never considered themselves that before. And this has been a concern of ours for a while, especially given the generosity of the benefits of our unemployment insurance system, at least in the short term, given that $600 top off from the federal government. What can we do to help those who are actually, still out in the workplace taking some risks? And so I think there's kind of two things at play there. One is what you might call sort of a hazard pay strategy, right? Where you find a way to get sort of additional wages for employees that are taking that risk. And you've seen the market bear that out a little bit, right? Like Cub Food popped up their wages per hour by $2. Other businesses have done the same, and they've been able to do that obviously because their sales have gone up, and I think also because it's the right thing to do. But you've seen the market stall for some of that, which is always what we love to see first before government steps in. As we've looked at ideas like hazard pay from the perspective of government, it's expensive, and it's not something that states can solve for. We came to that conclusion pretty quickly, and it was not a pleasant conclusion to come to. But the scope and scale of enacting a hazard pay system at the state level is extraordinary. And state governments like ours across the country are not able to print money, not able to go into debt. And our general funds are tanking, not tanking, but they're going down based on decreased tax revenue. So it's nowhere near something that we could handle at the state level. I think it really then becomes a national issue. And, I think the congressional delegation from Minnesota is probably not all unanimous about this, but certainly there are those in that delegation who fought for it and continue to fight for it nationally. And we continue to be hopeful that they'll be successful. I think there's a broader issue, though, that goes beyond just the acute hazard pay conversation, which goes into things like universal basic income and the floors that we create in society for anybody who's out there taking a risk. And I think that you're just going to see a whole new conversation on the social compact that we have with workers like the ones you refer to, Paul. And, my hope is, I don't know what the policy solution is there just yet, but I believe we want to come to a policy solution that redefines things a little bit so that we recognize the value these workers provide to us, that I think in an era of high technology and everything is virtual, you kind of forget that no, actually there's a lot of jobs you got to be in person for, and we all depend deeply on them for our survival and our happiness. And so I do hope this is a watershed moment where we can make some shifts based on that. And I appreciate your question and the spirit behind it.
Thank you. And Paul, it's always good to hear your voice. So thanks for raising your hand. Next up, we have Allie Strong Martin. Then we will check in with Kate on any questions, and then David Lai up after that. So Allie, you're on.
Hi, Marie. Thank you for having me. My name's Allie Strong Martin, and I work for LifeWorks Services. We are a nonprofit who serves people with disabilities, and we are headquartered in Eagan in Dakota County. Our question really that we have for you, Commissioner Grove, is that as we are a nonprofit who's also a reimbursing employer under the Minnesota Unemployment Insurance Trust, we are at the point of estimating that our second quarter invoice will be upwards of $750,000. And that this is a really substantial amount of cash that we are being asked to pay out without any guidance of when we can expect to be reimbursed the 50% of the federal relief as defined in the CARES Act. So my question with that comment being made is that we would like to know if DEED has any additional or new information at all at this time regarding the process of reimbursement, or when employers will expect to receive that 50% in federal relief. And if you don't have any new information at this time, could you give us an estimate maybe of when these important details will be figured out and communicated out to nonprofits? Thank you.
Thanks, Allie. This is an issue that I just got off a meeting with our legislative team and a few others on just an hour ago, and was talking about with Minnesota's tribes just yesterday. And I think there's a couple of things at play here. One is that the Department of Labor federally has yet to give us more guidelines on exactly how to handle reimbursements. They've said so far that 50% of that reimbursement cost will be waived, but they haven't spoken to the other 50%. And so we're still waiting for some guidance on how the federal government's going to handle this, if they're going to go further or not. You know, we have not, as a department, currently been sending out bills to reimbursement employers yet, because we want to wait to see what that guidance is, and because we know right now it's harder than ever to pay those bills. And as you saw in Executive Order 2004, when we put forward our unemployment insurance expansions for COVID, we indicated that we want to make sure that taxpaying employers aren't having to bear the burden of this moment. And you could apply that same kind of thesis to the nonprofit and reimbursing employers market too. The reality is eventually we're gonna have to pay back the unemployment insurance trust fund once we start taking loan payments from the federal government, which, as we announced last week, will be happening in the next month or so. And so that plays into the decision here a little bit too, in terms of what can be done. We're not at a point yet where we understand the scope and scale of this and are able to make a decision based on what that other percentage of the reimbursement fund would come in at, or what we would require there. But I'll just tell you, it's an active conversation, and I think more clarity from the Department of Labor is going to be helpful for us, and then a firmer handle on exactly the scope and scale and cost of this. So it's helpful to know, for example, that what your bill is. You said $750,000 is not small money. As we take a look at this, because the whole state's going to have to dig ourselves out of this hole in a couple of years that we're going to go into by borrowing from the federal government, and how we do that in a way that's fair, recognizes the challenges that different types of employers face. These are the really tricky policy questions that we have to figure out. And at this point, I would just say to you, we haven't issued bills to this yet for the reasons you can all understand and hopefully appreciate, and are taking this time to really evaluate what the possible options can be, given where the federal government will come down on this.
There we go. Thank you, Allie, for the question. And I just want to emphasize Allie's question from MCN's perspective too. This has been the #1 issue that we're being contacted about from nonprofits statewide since, late March. I I think the guidance that Allie is talking about, we need. We also need to know how DEED is interpreting the statute that says if an organization has laid off 25% or more of its employees that due to an act of nature, then that will be relieved. It would be great for some of those organizations who are going to be having massive bills to know that, yep, that is what the statute said, that is how we're interpreting it, and that is what will happen. There's no guidance. And so our nonprofits are really concerned, and reasonably so. And I recognize, like you said, it's a really tricky policy question, and it is. There's a lot of money that we're talking about, and it does need to be fair. And at the same time, nonprofits have already gotten their bills for the first quarter, which had about 2 weeks of COVID time in it. And now we're just kind of waiting and don't know if they're going to have a massive bill in August or no bill in August or partial bill. So anything you can do to push that along would be, we'd be most grateful. Let's see, next is, I want to check with Kate Barr and see if she's got any questions in the written chat.
Yeah, thank you, Marie, and thank you for Commissioner Grove for joining us. There are some questions that people have chatted in. I think that they were on the phone or using other technology. So the first question comes from Jean Lee, and I'm going to summarize a little bit of what Jean said because I think that it covers many participants. The question is for small organizations, and this is both small businesses and small nonprofits, this moment in time is often the first time that they're actually considering applying for some sort of relief from a state agency. And so they don't have the processes and knowledge of the systems and the forms and the requirements. And the question that Jean asks, and I think that many are asking, is how can DEED and the other state agencies really be as helpful as possible at simplifying, streamlining, making access and information and assistance most available, so that overwhelming requirement for paperwork and documents and requirements can be managed and not be overwhelming at a time when they really need to be serving their communities and taking care of their employees.
I'm trying to figure out what she's referring to, like what specific program she's applying for, if it's just a general comment about government.
Yeah. I don't know. I don't know. Yeah.
Well, I'll say this. First of all, it always pains me to hear that because I think government needs to be a lot more easy to work with than it is today. And we have definitely made it a priority of ours to try to simplify our grants application process is one example, make it a lot faster, make the requirements smaller. Hopefully those of you who follow DEED have seen, if you're a grantee of ours, we've made a number of major evolutions on that front over the past year and a half in terms of requiring less documentation, making the window and time of things a lot clearer and consistent across all of our work, requiring less reviews internally, and holding people accountable for the right things, not the things that are silly. So that's been a priority of ours, but I'm not going to tell you we've always gotten it perfectly right. Again, I'm not sure what particular process that Jean's referring to, but I'd just say, with Maureen Ramirez here and others at DEED who are working on the outreach side of things, if there's anything you're confused about or the process doesn't work for you, we want to hear about it. We want to know what's wrong exactly. And so obviously this is a broad question here, and that's to be expected in a forum like this, but the specific questions and the specific concerns are ones we want to hear too, because we don't want DEED to be a place that's hard to navigate. We want it to be a place that's easy to navigate, and where there's clarity and transparency. And look, DEED as a whole is an agency that's tasked with giving out a lot of money. So we better get that right. We better make that easy and simple and transparent and clear. And if we aren't getting that right, then folks like Jean need to be very specific and let us know how so we can fix it.
Thank you. And Marie, can I ask one more and then you can go back to the hand? So
yes,
one more question, Commissioner, that I think is probably top of mind for you comes from Vamin from the Asian Economic Development Association, which is specific to the damage and some of the extra costs and the destruction that was done in the last 2 weeks. And I'm sure that DEED has been front of mind thinking about what kind of relief and potential targeted work will be available for that and for the additional assistance and the additional both physical and small business and organizational relief that'll be needed. So do you have something that you can share with us about where that's at?
You know, we've been in a lot of conversations on this over the last week and a half. I've spent a lot of time myself on the ground in the neighborhoods that were affected. I know Maureen has too, and Hamza Warfa and several of our team. We've held a lot of chats just like this one with businesses that have been affected, nonprofits that have been affected. And I think there's kind of the short term and the long term, right? In the short term, there are certainly businesses or institutions for whom, gosh, just a little bit of money to repair a window or pay an insurance deductible could kind of get you back in action pretty quick. And then there's a longer term issue of just rebuilding these corridors in a way that supports the community in which they are in. And you know, that longer term effort is going to require some thoughtful consideration on bonding, probably on general fund dollars too at some point, and then probably on appropriation bonds too that go directly to businesses and organizations that are going to rebuild, all under the consideration that gentrification is going to be an issue we need to tackle carefully. And that bringing these neighbors back in a way that really fosters the economic growth of the very business owners who were affected is a core priority. In the short term, that kind of micro grant idea is one that we have discussed a lot. I think we're being, thoughtful at state government to make sure we're letting the cities lead on this. It's that they know their cities best. They know the organizations affected the best. And also knowing that the legislators in those districts also have a good pulse on what's needed. So, you know, we're looking at a lot of different solutions. And my hope is that this special session will yield some results on that front. But it's going to take some time, more time than we probably want to land the kind of funding that we need given the crisis that we're in. But the governor's made it clear it's a priority that we really want to tackle, and it affects obviously both businesses and nonprofits.
Thank you.
Commissioner, you mentioned your staff a minute ago, so I do just want to ask you to pass along a very sincere thank you to your staff, which I know is a lot of people, but I know I and a lot of other folks on this call have worked with a number of your staff, and it's obvious that they are working quadruple time and have been for 3 months now. So we see that, and we really appreciate it. One quick tech note, it looks like there are 2 folks who are using their phones only. And so if either of you have a question, you can push *9 on your phone and that will raise your hand and then we'll call on you. So next up in the queue, we've got David Lai, Lorna Schmidt, and Chris Vanacek. So David, over to you.
Hey, can you hear me? I just want to start by saying thank you. My name is David Lee. I'm from a social startup that supports micro small businesses, mom and pop stores. And I live and work out of 38th in Portland, which is like, I walk down the block and I see, 38th in Chicago. I used to work in that corner every day at Black Eye Coffee. And I've seen the result of, the pain of racism impact not only me as a person, but the local small business community. And want to just voice a question around what's in consideration for, the special session program. So one thing I know about the nature of COVID and the recovery is that more businesses are going to have to rely on technology in their business model in the transition from a pre-COVID to a post-COVID world. And many mom and pop shops are going to, not only have institutional and financial challenges to that, but, technical challenges. And I worry that we're not necessarily well positioned to help those mom and pop shops transition. So I'm curious as to what the conversations have been to support technical and technological literacy and transition from DEED and nonprofits. Thank you.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right that technology is going to play a key role in this recovery. And I think one of the things we've been looking at is like, how do we do service delivery at a time when being in person is just a little bit harder to get right? And so we've kind of pulled together a SWAT team for our own services, our career force services, to look for new ways to deliver services via technology. And, whether that's through video conference or through phone calls or through online training tools, we have a lot that we're cooking up there. And it doesn't have to be things that we create on our own necessarily. These can be third-party tools that we pull together and leverage too. So there are lots of, I think, exciting avenues there. And even though no one would have ever wished any of this on us, I think that kind of constraint that this pandemic has brought also breeds creativity in terms of how we think about new solutions. And I think it also, I think, will influence how we think about nonprofit partnerships too. I mean, if you have a nonprofit out there that's using technology in a unique way, or maybe the money that they need is to fund a technology approach versus to fund, a headcount or, a location, I think we have to start to be flexible about the way that we think about our dollars too, given the possibility that technology is going to change service delivery in a pretty big way.
Thank you. We've got now Lorna and then Chris, and then we'll check back with Kate for questions in the chat. So Lorna, you are on.
Hi, thank you. This is Lorna Schmidt. I'm the Public Policy Manager with Catholic Charities of St. Paul in Minneapolis, based right here in Minneapolis. My question is related to federal activity. So we know there's been a lot of discussion, even in conversations with our state lawmakers and the administration, just this recognition that the scope of COVID-19's impact means that we are going to need resources far beyond what our state can provide alone. So wondering if there's anything that you can share about conversations that you and the administration might be having with our congressional delegation about support for nonprofits, and specifically mid-sized nonprofits, as we've largely been ineligible for many of the federal relief packages that have been passed to date.
Interesting. So like is Catholic Charities more than 500 employees, for example?
We are 584.
Oh, yeah. Those numbers are always, I wouldn't say arbitrary, but it's always tricky, right? If you're just on the other edge of them. So I assume you weren't eligible for some of the SBA stuff.
That's correct. Yeah, we've been ineligible for everything that we've looked at.
Yeah. No, I think this is an important question. I mean, we do meet with the congressional delegation once a week, every Tuesday morning, myself, the governor, LG, and Jan Malcolm, and a few other commissioners where it's relevant, and conversations really tackle a wide range of things. I think what would be helpful for me to understand from all of you is how to think about nonprofits differently than a business. Because I think we kind of, and there's obvious differences are in the very tax code that you live under, but in terms of assistance, like the kinds of things that a nonprofit needs that maybe it's different from a business. Because I think it's been easier for us to use a shorthand of like nonprofits and businesses as it relates to SBA programs or what have you. But I guess longer from your perspective, when you think about relief, how should we, what kind of factors should we be considering for nonprofits that would be maybe different from the factors we would consider for a business?
Yeah, like I say, I think there are a group of us that have been discussing this quite a bit and have a number of suggestions, and would be happy to follow up with you to avoid taking too much time here. But just quickly, some of the things that have come up are the fact that, nonprofits by our nature, like we operate on very thin margins. So paying loans back is something that is difficult, if not impossible, for many of them. Even low interest loans can be challenging. Just by the nature of those margins. So that's part of it. And I guess the one thing that's coming to mind most specifically, but then as you noted too, like the count of employees is more arbitrary. And so thinking more in terms of that structure, and then knowing too that for many of us, we rely heavily on government contracts, and so thinking about how we continue to support some of that as well. But the margins, the focus on loans, interest rates, a lot of that has proven problematic for what we've seen come out so far.
Got it. That's helpful. All righty. Well, that's good. I mean, I think at the state level, we've delayed payments to service requirements for nonprofits that we work with, et cetera. But I think at the federal level, anything you have that you want to send to me either directly or through Marie or someone else on the kind of list of things we should be focused on and should advocate for with our congressional delegation, I'd love to see it.
Absolutely. We'll follow up. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Lorna. Next up is Chris. Then we'll go over to Kate to see if there's any chat questions or if she has any questions, and then back to Paul. So Chris, you're up.
Hi, my name is Chris Vanacek, and I work at TechDump. We're located in the Midway neighborhood of St. Paul. We do employee workforce development, particularly with people that have barriers to employment, and electronics recycling and refurbished sales. So my question revolves around kind of this midterm time period. We had the CARES Act, got in huge infusion of cash. Now all that program's kind of running out, and depending on who you ask, the COVID's not just going to go away magically at the end of the summer. So wondering what DEED, or if you know anything about at the federal level, any talks going on about kind of another wave of support that might come out.
And Chris, do you mean from the federal government?
Either federal government or if there's anything DEED's been talking about doing.
Yeah, I think I think we're looking at a small business bill for the upcoming session, which should be helpful for businesses that are affected by the crisis. I think, also on our mind is, of course, the districts that were affected by the civil unrest after George Floyd's murder, and so that's on the sort of radar. Unemployment insurance, policy changes are certainly something that are being discussed a lot. Many of your clients may be young people. There's obviously a bill moving around on under 18 unemployment insurance that we're currently prohibited from providing based on the way Minnesota statutes are written. So that's on the radar. And then I think, part of the special session we hope is that there's ideas generated by legislators of all types, and we move very quickly to provide the assistance they need to put together legislation that works. But we'll be tracking a lot of the ideas coming from the legislature too.
Thanks.
All right, thanks, Chris. I love Tech Dump, so it's great to hear you on. Kate, over to you for any questions from the chat, or I know that you've got a couple questions as well.
Yes, I'm going to take the power of having the microphone to ask a question of my own. Commissioner, you had alluded early on to the importance of the nonprofit sector in employment, and the economic activity of the state was 13% of the employees, and 9,000 nonprofit employers. And I just urge you on behalf of everyone on this call to include nonprofits as much as possible in the relief for small businesses. The SBA did it with small businesses and nonprofits, and then to make that case to the legislature as they are talking about bills where they're defining it. I know that the Senate had a hearing today about a relief grant package, and a grant package is ideal, as Lorna talked about. And if there are things that we can do from both Propel and from MCN to help equip you with making that case, and with making the case about the value of nonprofits as a version of small businesses in their communities, that we would be happy to be part of that case making, and happy to help also demystify this for nonprofits in terms of, there are some, of course, quirks to nonprofits that sometimes have to be consideration about the different buckets of funding, and how to really make sure that those funds are used to keep employees working, keep communities served, and make sure that we're just keeping it in mind. So I guess kind of the shorthand is, let's remember the nonprofits. I know you do, I know you understand it. And so the more that we, as both MCN, Propel, and the nonprofit sector, help you make that case and reach out to legislators make that case, let us know how we can be helpful.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I'd be curious, Kate, to hear from you or Maria or anybody on what you think the most pressing challenges are. Is it funding dollars that are drying up? Is it the inability to provide services and therefore reimbursements can't come in? Is it just the low margins overall? Help me get a little smarter on this. I mean, I know the challenges my own nonprofit's facing, but we're small, so I'm curious if you were to summarize kind of the unique things that you're all facing that would maybe differentiate you from business. I'd love to hear them.
Well, I'm going to offer just a couple of responses. One is that while nonprofits are not, of course, a monolithic sector, but across the board, the largest expense of nonprofits is employment. Not inventory, not facilities, but employment. Yep. And so there are just less levers about not buying as much inventory to manage cash flow. And nonprofits generally have quite low reserves, quite little amount of cash on hand, and very little access to other cash. As you know, borrowing money comes with a whole other burden for nonprofits that is a delicate balance. And so it really is the combination of low margin, but the fast reduction in revenue for nonprofits that really started, you know, March 15th, revenue just kind of took a dive, especially when they could no longer provide direct services, provide things that were earned income related, and then provide things that even were state contract and county contracts that were reimbursable. And the agencies have been quite flexible, but cash flow has just dried up overall. And trying to balance all of those complications just really makes it, it's this Rubik's Cube, as you know, at all times. So, but the sheer size of the employment cost is probably the number one.
Mm-hmm.
And I see that Lorna noted in the chat that she would like to answer that question as well. So Sandra, if you could unmute Lorna, that would be great. Thanks.
Hi, Lorna with Catholic Charities again. Thanks for the opportunity to comment. I appreciate what you were just saying right now. I would agree that the greatest expenses that we have seen as an organization have been related to workforce, though we have seen significant increases in our operational expenses as well. So it is a combination, but I think it is correct that at least in our scenario, workforce remains like the largest. But in regards to some of the revenue, the other thing that I would add is that we have, we're very fortunate in Minnesota that we have a strong community that is very supportive of nonprofits. And so we have seen a number of donations being made. But in addition to questions about revenue and longer term sustainability of some of that, what we also don't know is that are some of the donations that are coming through right now, people donating sooner than they would have otherwise. People who may usually give their large contribution at the end of the year in December, is that now coming earlier? And so it's hard to know the full impact of that charitable giving, on our revenues as well. And so that's another thing that I think makes many of us nervous. So very interested in some of the conversations that are also happening around benefits, tax deductions for charitable giving.
And I'll take a minute and answer that question as well. I think you hit the nail head on talking about revenue, right? Revenue is obviously a big deal for nonprofits. The pandemic hit right at the beginning of gala and banquet season. There are a good number of small nonprofits who earn half of their yearly revenue at one gala. And, for some, they were able to pivot and move it online, but that's not going to bring in as much revenue. And some had to just be canceled overall. Service fees, you mentioned that as well. Any organization that has fees for service, whether they be extremely low or not, they're losing out on that money because they can't perform services. Theaters and museums, of course, are just not taking in any revenue because nobody's buying tickets. And then donations, of course, are always unpredictable. So you've got smaller nonprofits who rely more heavily on individual donations, and we don't have a sense of what that's going to look like over the next few months or years. Are people going to give more because of what's happening or give less because of what's happening? It's unclear. And there are also, I think there's just some questions about what foundations are going to do. Are foundations going to pivot what causes they're giving to? What causes they're partnering with? And there's just, people don't know. And so a big part of it is the different forms of revenue for nonprofits as opposed to for-profit businesses.
So a lot of uncertainty in the market, whether it's funding timelines or sort of giving trends. You mentioned the reimbursing employer issue earlier before. Yeah, it's a bit of a frothy time, and kind of knowing what's coming is hard. I mean, this is true in so many sectors, but this is helpful for me to hear the kind of the unique ways in which it hits nonprofits. So I appreciate everyone's answers to that.
Good, I'm glad that was helpful. Let's see, we'll take a question from Paul again, and then it looks like Eileen Casper has a question, and then Dawn. So Paul, you are up.
So Commissioner, I just want to emphasize Lorna's original question in this last line of thought. I won't repeat everything, but so in addition to everything else that nonprofits have taken on, There's also been new training that has been a part of responding to coronavirus. There's been PPE stockpiled and everything else. So all of this expense, new expense, and yet no opportunity for us or Catholic charities to apply for PPP. Lutheran Social Service has 2,300 plus employees. So we have also been ineligible and haven't seen any sign that there's going to be any opportunity. And in addition to that, we serve those who need our service. So if something happened to us, then all of these people are left out into the cold. So just to add a little color to the recent discussion. And then I thought I'd also comment on the other thing real quickly. And so what have we been doing in response to the George Floyd murder? So I'm the social justice advocate. One thing that I have not been doing is sleeping much lately because of people, employees wanting to know, what do we do? What's the response? And then having a lot of urgency around that and wanting to do something immediately. And then how do we as an organization shift from the need to just respond, and be deliberate about what kind of response it needs. And then some people thinking we now need to operate out of the lines of our expertise. So how do we center some conversation and help us focus on what we're good at and how to respond with what we're good at in this moment as well. And that's been really challenging. And so I kind of expect that challenge, but that's been really challenging, how to lean into that and how to turn towards what our expertise is, serve in response to the George Floyd murder, but serve in areas of our expertise and not feel the need to do everything. Thank you.
Well said, Paul. Yep. Well said. Thank you for your leadership and for your hard work. You're putting on lots of different hats these days. I think in many ways we all are. You want an ecosystem where people are operating from strength. And at the same time, we're all having to try and do new things we never imagined we would. So it's that balance of stretching from strength that I think is so important. Thank you for that.
And I'll add just on the piece about these mid-sized nonprofits not being eligible for the PPP loans because they have over 500 employees. I actually used to work at Catholic Charities too. So this is very Catholic Charities focused. But, that agency is really like a lot of smaller nonprofits. There's something like 19 sites, right? But under one umbrella and one administrative unit. And so, there's just, I think, some inherent unfortunateness that they're doing the same work as smaller nonprofits, but not seeing that kind of relief.
Yeah, this has been enlightening for me to understand that the size limitations for a business as it comes to this kind of make more sense than they do for a nonprofit, because what you're trying to indicate with the size limitations of a business is there's a stability there that is greater than the stability of a smaller size company. But it's not necessarily, and in the case for a nonprofit, it doesn't mean they're not stable, but it's just the margins are thinner. The human resources aren't allocated in the same way that's navigating towards profit. It's navigating simply towards impact. And so it's just a different calculation. This has been helpful for me to hear that.
Good. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I think we've got time for 2 more questions. So Eileen, you're up next. And then Dawn, you'll have the last question. Eileen, are you able to unmute yourself? Okay, oh wait, I think it's working. Are you there, Eileen?
Thank you. Yes, my name is Eileen Casper. I'm on the board of the Latino Economic Development Center and work with Genesis Works. I wanted to bring to light something that is very, I think, unusual in these times of crisis, which is that there are some youth now that are the sole income earners for their families, especially within our very I don't know the right word to use, but within our Black and Brown communities, very low income communities. And it's really devastating. And Genesis Works, we're able to provide paid internship opportunities and stipends and all sorts of income. But I just wanted to bring up the fact that youth are playing an essential role in many families currently, a role that they're taking on in addition to doing remote high school and going to college. So that is something that our society isn't quite prepared for. We're not really recognizing, and it would be wonderful if DEED could take a role. The second part too is that our Latino and Afro-Latino communities are facing some very unique challenges at this time too. We are all very well aware of the tensions with immigration that are happening, and just want to thank the state of Minnesota for the work that you're continuing to do with our communities as we're trying to find our ways through this crisis and leading together.
Thanks, Eileen. That's really helpful. And yeah, I know it's definitely true that for many families that a kid having a job isn't just a kind of character building experience, but it's an experience that supports the family overall. And, you know, I think we have some youth work programs at DEED that do workforce development, and they're helpful. I think we could use a lot more. And I also think that, you know, this legislation and conversation on employment insurance for young people needs to have its day and needs to be heard. And I think there's some really good points to be made there. And so I'm glad you're raising these issues. They're definitely on our radar.
Thanks so much.
And let's see, our last question of the day is going to be from Dawn. So Dawn, you're up.
Hi, Commissioner Grove. This is Dawn Wambeck with CAPI USA. Just want to thank you for having all of us today and having the opportunity to hear from everybody. This was great. CAPI has a long legacy of serving immigrants, refugees, and people of color. We have 2 locations, one in Brooklyn Center and another on 37th and Lake Street. I just wanted to kick off by saying just a very quick success story. Prior to starting off with COVID and before the impact of COVID, we had about over 35 people getting ready to move into nursing assistant training. And then COVID hit, and we thought that it would, you know, we would lose most of the people. And in fact, almost all individuals went on to training, into online training through Hennepin Technical College and Minneapolis College. So right now there's about 35 people, and I believe the other 2 people had started and actually have COVID-19 themselves and had to take a break from the program. So I wanted to share the resiliency of the community that we saw. I know it lifts me up every day and helps propel me forward. So I wanted to share that with you too. In order to make that happen, we did fundraising, we purchased laptops, and I think around 1/3 to half of the people that we supported did need the support of technology loaned to them. So that was a cost. Luckily, we had funders who did come behind graciously and supported us with that. But I think if this is longer term, that will be a cost of many organizations. Also, just looking forward to the fact that we're swinging into such of a high unemployment rate and knowing the disparities for immigrants, refugees, and people of color, we're starting to think as an organization about what other retooling we will need to do to support people in the community to find new pathways, new jobs, and will there be any opportunity for flexible training dollars in the future? And then just we're looking at needing to have a lot more staffing to support people in just finding general employment as well. So those are some of the things that we're thinking about. Some of the biggest pressure points that we have seen from the community we continue to see are the need for assistance with rental assistance, utility assistance, car repair, just really some of these emergency needs. And if there's ever any opportunities for any of that to be, you know, issued out to nonprofits to support the community, I just want to say that's greatly appreciated. We've received a couple small grants, but we continue to see that as a really big pressure point in the community. And then also just the conversation around the uncertainty of the future for nonprofits, and knowing that you know, our services are going to be so greatly needed in the next 1 to 3 years, but then also recognizing the impact on the economy. And so we really appreciate DEED and the state keeping that in mind, and as much as possible helping to protect the future longevity of organizations.
Thanks for that, Don. All great points. maybe I'll just say in closing, thank you for that, and for everyone here in your questions, your thoughtful advice, and also your leadership right now in our state. It's very much not only appreciated, but essential to the moment that we're in. And so I've learned a lot from this conversation. I feel like I've gotten a little smarter on some of the challenges that you all face. I understand the urgency that you feel in some of the issues that DEED touches, and I'm grateful for the time. So thanks, Kate, Marie, the team for putting this together.
Well, and thank you so much for the time and for joining us, Commissioner Grove, and to your staff and to Maureen Ramirez. And I just want to remind the people on the call that the Commissioner's staff will be provided with a copy of the chat. We had a couple of questions come in right at the last minute that were about workforce development programs that I know are of keen interest to the Commissioner, so we'll make sure that he and his staff get those questions because they're important questions to ask. We certainly appreciate the opportunity to share this with you, Commissioner, and as you heard, there is creativity and flexibility and willingness and passion on the part of the nonprofit sector, and great interest in working with you and your staff to continue to support the community and to help to make these the dollars that are available as effective and valuable as they can be. So thanks again for joining us, and thanks for everyone, and thanks to MCN for the partnership.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.